Yes. Yes, you'll turn that in on Friday. Okay, so we talked about the history of political parties yesterday. You're gonna get some more information on that a little later. But now we're on to who belongs to each party. So we're kind of into this, what are we currently looking at? So again, these are generalities because, you know, everybody is a little different. But in general, who belongs to each party? For Republicans, it's men who are older, we see typically over 50, and wealthy. Those are the three main categories that are very strong in the Republican Party. If we're looking at race, it's a lot of white, upper middle class. As far as Democrats go, they are made up of women, young voters, young people, non-whites, Latinos, African Americans, Asian Americans, members of labor unions, typically in the Democratic Party. Okay, so we need to talk about some of the differences between political parties. I wish that your book would have talked about the similarities of the parties, because I just don't think that there's a lot out there that tells you those things, but unfortunately they're going to focus on the differences, which is quite common, obviously. So main differences in the Democrat and Republican Party. Democrats tend to favor education. They want to find a way for government to aid in poverty, homelessness, and health care. They are in favor of Social Security and Medicaid. Republicans tend to focus much more on the military and national defense. And in general, they sort of feel like government should stay out of the everyday lives of people. That if you are poor or homeless or need health care, you need to get a job, you need to be able to get yourself out of that situation. It's not necessarily government's role to do that for you. And if it is, government's role should only be temporary. That there should be a definite end time when government will stop, aiding you. Just because I feel like it needs to be said, some of the similarities in political parties, both parties tend to favor rights for veterans, giving military families benefits, sort of paying back for those things. They tend to value the idea of education. They differ in how they think education should be given, but the idea that everyone deserves an education is most definitely something that they both share. Other things, in general, they sort of feel like our country needs to continue to stay a world leader. Again, they differ in how to do that, but they both agree that the United States needs to stay a world power and make sure that they make good decisions in that aspect. Okay, so let's talk about the 2012 election. The book's going to really talk more about the 2012 election because the book is fairly new, but it obviously didn't really cover a lot of 2014 and certainly not 2016. But what we're starting to see is some issues kind of take precedent. In 2012, the main issue in this election is the economy. We're really struggling to still get ourselves out of that economic recession that happened in 2008, 2009. So in the 2012 election, there's a really big piece to that. But we also see big social issues, reproductive rights, healthcare initiatives. The Affordable Health Care Act has been passed, and there's still this, at the time, there was still this idea that it needed to be repealed or changed. Abortion issues, international threats, terrorism has been a kind of reoccurring issue in the last few elections, and immigration as well. Okay, So this is a graph that your book has, and it's about where the top 10 priority issues by party identification. What the graph is sort of showing you is that there are a lot of differences between the parties about what the priorities of government should be. There's very rarely something that they totally agree on, and the one that you can clearly tell they agree on was the economy. And obviously that would have been a big issue. But things like, well, crime is a pretty big one, but things like immigration, world affairs, Republicans tend to favor that as a much more of a priority, whereas Democrats are looking at more of the environment and things like that. So what you can kind of tell us that not only do our parties differ on how to handle issues, they're now starting to differ on what the issues are that we should handle. And that will definitely change the way politics looks in the future. Okay, so why has the two-party system endured? We need to kind of talk about some of the pieces here of a two-party system. First, we have historical foundations in this two-party system. We have come from a two-party system. There's really no alternative that's been given that the American people tend to like. The two-party system, again, is sort of our social understanding of how we relate in the world. We tend to divide ourselves and find groups that fit us. And in politics, it's really just been two parties. We also use this two-party system for political socialization and practical considerations. It allows us to find a place in our political society. It allows us to identify in politics in some way. And so that has definitely helped continue this two-party system. The third piece, and this is huge, especially for this debate, somebody needs to bring this up in the debate, please, the Electoral College. The Electoral College has allowed the two-party system to continue, and it will allow the two-party system to continue, because again, remember that in the Electoral College, you have to have enough votes. If you split the Electoral College into 3 candidates, so you have a third party playing, it is so much harder to get those majority of votes. The Electoral College, not that the founders intended this, but it's really only built for 2 people. Because to get the majority of the electoral votes, if you're running against 2 other people, it is really, really hard to get that majority and win the election. So the winner-take-all electoral system has been an issue.
What happens if there's a tie?
Then it goes to Congress. So the Senate gets to decide, and the House of Representatives gets to decide. They each pick the president and the vice president.
The corrupt party, you think?
And then state and federal laws favoring the two-party system. Just in general, our media favors a two-party system. You're going to notice third parties don't get a lot of media buy-in. They don't, we don't have a third-party debate. Today we have a Republican Party debate tonight. We've had Democratic Party debates. You haven't seen a third-party debate. Number 1, because the media outlets aren't going to cover it. Number 2, because we don't want to talk about it. We aren't interested in learning about a third party. It just doesn't work very well. In some elections, third parties have been stronger than others. So the historical foundations of the two-party system starts in Federalist and Anti-Federalist. It goes through slavery in the North versus the South, then to the Great Depression over economic differences. Now we're seeing two-party systems becoming entrenched in the climate change debate as well as healthcare. It has lasted so long that it starts to become difficult to see an alternative. When we talk about political socialization and practical considerations, the other thing you have to realize is that children grow up only learning about the two parties typically, and they typically hear that from their parents. You're socialized in a political world to only know that there are Republicans and Democrats. We don't have a lot of households that are talking about third parties. We don't have a lot of ways for you to learn about the third party, and so it kind of becomes just this tradition that's kind of handed down. And children at a fairly young age start to think of themselves as Democrats or Republicans. You don't find, a 16-year-old who's, I'm a third party, I'm an independent. Typically, they're happy to say that they're Democratic or Republican, even if they don't really know what that means. Okay, so we're going to talk, I kind of touched on this, so I won't do a lot here in this winner-take-all electoral system, but essentially, what it is that the Electoral College, if it continues to stay the way that it is, will continue to favor only two parties running. It's why right now the Republican Party is very nervous about one of the candidates moving to a third party, because not only does it make the Republican Party look a little disorganized, it's also going to take electoral votes from a potential Republican Party candidate. So the problem there is that now they've got to work twice as hard because they're going to have another candidate vying for electoral representation. And then those state and federal laws favoring the two parties. So for things like the Federal Election Committee rules for campaign finance also place restrictions on minor party candidates. So the FEC has restrictions on how much you can spend to a candidate. And for a third party candidate, that's really important because they don't have as many donors as a Democratic Party or a Republican Party candidate. So when there's that limit, that's going to be a big issue if they can't get their campaign funds high enough. Okay, so let's talk about the role of minor parties in US politics. We have what we call third parties or ideological third parties. These are obviously a party that differs from the Republican or the Democratic Party. Third parties can come into existence in three ways, okay? First way, they may be founded by individuals or groups who are committed to a particular interest, issue, or ideology. So we've seen third parties come out of just a very specific issue. Is that my phone?
Yeah.
Okay. It's so quiet now. Miss Hubble's room. Yes, I do. Sounds good. Okay. Yep, bye. Tanner, you gotta go. You're going to an appointment, so grab your coat and stuff. To office. Oh. Man. Okay.
You sure it's right now? I thought it was 8:45.
She said it's 8:15. You need to leave at 8:15 to go to Fort Atkins.
Alright.
I got a lot of information about it that I didn't really need, but she felt like she needed to tell me about it.
Alright.
In Fort Atkinson.
Yeah.
Have fun.
Will do.
Okay. So this ideological, so that there might be one specific issue that makes someone break away from the party. We could maybe put Donald Trump in this if he leaves for a different party, in the sense that he's come out with these ideas of especially immigration policy that the Republican Party really doesn't agree with, and so that might be his ideological split. It might be the thing that splits him. The second way a third party can come into existence is if you split off from one of the other major parties and a group becomes dissatisfied. We call this a splinter party. Essentially, it comes out of a major party. It shares still a lot of the same things, but they just want to do it differently. This is the Tea Party. The Tea Party is considered a splinter party. They branched off of the Republican Party. They still kind of consider themselves Republicans, but they want to do things very differently, and so that's why they have their own party, sort of. And then the last one is that a third party could be started through a particular leader who serves as the person's vehicle for contesting elections. This would be Donald Trump. So the reason Donald Trump can go ahead and say that he wants to become a part of a third party is because he knows he's a charismatic leader and he's doing well in the polls, that should he branch off into the third party, he actually might do okay. Lots of people who branch into third parties tend to not do very well because things are going to start to die off a little bit. I think Trump's been hearing a lot in his advisories that he could, and he could be successful. That remains to be seen. We will see. But there is definitely, I think, some discussion. And if I was really honest with you, I think there's a very good chance that before the national convention, he will rip up his pledge to the Republican Party and start a third party. I think part of it is he'll actually be pressured from the Republican Party to do that. I think at this point the Republican Party is sort of ready to let him go because he's pushing their party so extreme that they're going to lose votes. And so it's not in their best interest anymore to keep him as their candidate. Now, unfortunately, the Republican Party can't do anything right now. You know, they don't get to decide that. He's doing pretty well, so. Okay. Third parties have forced major parties to recognize new issues and trends in the thinking of America. So we're talking about impact of minor parties. They definitely bring up a lot of issues. They definitely question a lot of things. They don't go with the status quo. They make candidates talk about issues they don't want to talk about, which is important, especially in a presidential candidacy. Some examples, ideological third parties. These are the longest lived parties that have strong ideological foundations. The Libertarian Party could be considered a third party. They believe in capitalist economic programs and hands-off policy. That's their ideological piece, it's economic. We also have the Green Party. The Green Party is a stronger ideological third party, and they believe in grassroots environmentalism. They are also affiliated with parties around the world. They have some pretty strong pieces there. As far as splinter parties, I gave you the Tea Party as an example, also the Bull Moose Progressive Party that was formed by Teddy Roosevelt.
Bull Moose.
It came out of the Republican Party as well. Okay. Oh, Ralph Nader is a really popular name when we talk about third parties. He's run for president twice as an independent or a third party under the Green Party. And then Ross Perot also ran as a third party candidate twice. Obviously they didn't win, but it certainly kind of adds an element to a presidential candidacy or candidate race that sometimes we have and sometimes we don't. Okay, mechanisms for political change. There are some terms here that you need to know. First is what we call realignment. Realignment is a process in which a substantial group of voters switches party allegiance, producing a long-term change in political landscape. So realignment is when a group of people decides to switch their alliance from one party to another. When we look at it, just sitting here reading about it, the first thing that pops into my head is, wow, this would rarely ever happen. It actually happens more often than we think. Political parties are fluid. They are constantly trying to attract voters from the other side by saying or doing or introducing new legislation or things that might appeal to them. We have what we call the myth of dominance. A newly dominant party may replace a previous dominant party, and realignment could potentially happen here. People like to be in the dominant party. They like to be in the party that seems to be doing the best. And so sometimes that allows realignment. That if, the Republican Party starts to look very strong and organized and dominant, many people may go to the Republican Party because they sort of feel like, okay, well, they're dominant, they're successful, I will be a part of this party. We also have the myth of predictability. This is just the idea that after a certain period of time, people tend to switch. After a few years, we can sort of predict some of these things. Part of the myth of predictability is sort of as you grow older, you might change your party affiliation, so you might switch to your different parties. There's this myth that it takes place every 36 years, that the parties tend to switch a little bit. Obviously, that's not, super fact, but we've seen this pattern of political parties switching things up every few decades. Is realignment still possible? There's this big question out there that because our parties have become so entrenched in what they believe, are we ever going to have realignment? For realignment to occur, a substantial body of citizens must come to believe that their party can no longer represent their interests or values. It might happen. It might happen this year. There are a lot of people who are pretty dissatisfied with the way that our political parties are working. And when that dissatisfaction starts to grow and grow and grow, we often see some movement. And maybe we won't see movement this time towards one of the other parties. Maybe we will see movement to a third party. Who knows? But our political environment is so volatile right now that there's definitely a possibility of that. Okay, de-alignment. So de-alignment is the decline in party loyalties. It reduces a long-term party commitment. So de-alignment is sort of the idea of not really switching to the other party, but sort of pulling yourself out altogether. So this is the piece of independent voters. The book is going to show you a graph that actually shows that independent voters are increasing, which when I read it, I was like, oh, weird, because we just read this article about how there's less and less independent voters. But then the next paragraph tells you why. We have what we call not so independent voters. We have people who say that they're independent. They say, I don't like these two parties. No one's doing anything for me. But in reality, they're not so independent. In reality, they already still have a party. They know where they're going. And I think that's what the article that we read earlier was kind of talking about, is that even though we'd like to believe we want to listen to the candidates and we'll make an educated decision, most of us have a tendency to go to one party or another, and should we be asked, to vote today, we would be able to pick one of those. So it's sort of one of those odd things to take a look at, de-alignment, because it's one of those things where like someone says something and then does something very differently. So de-alignment is hard to sort of measure. Oh, I might finish this lecture. Cool. Swing voters are a part of de-alignment. These are voters who frequently swing their support from one party to another. We like swing voters. Swing voters are good, but swing voters are really dangerous because we don't know which way they'll swing at any time, and for parties that is a very big stressful piece. Tipping. Okay, tipping is a phenomenon that occurs when a group that has become more numerous over time grows large enough to change the political balance in a district, state, or country.
Can you repeat that, sorry?
Yep, it's a phenomenon that occurs when a group that's becoming more numerous over time grows large enough to change the political balance in a district, state, or country. So your book's going to talk about two examples, tipping in Massachusetts and tipping in California. Essentially, it's this idea that as generations grow and people move and things like that, we tend to see different districts, states, areas change in their political majority. And that can definitely change the way that our government looks. We see tipping because of generational change, because of movement, but also because of political events. So I don't think that Wisconsin is tipping in any way. I do think that we have changed in the last 8 years due to some of the state politics that have happened in our state. And should that continue, we may tip. Wisconsin is typically a swing state in general. We don't really have a tendency to go to one party or another, especially in presidential elections. But you'll often see this sort of like movement back and forth, depending on how things are happening. But we may see it stay the same. The thing I'm kind of alluding to here is that our governor, who is a very conservative Republican, has done two things that may change what it looks like for him to be reelected in a few years. Number one, he's done some things that have caused some people to step away from him, which may tip things to the other side. But he's also made some moves that had not allowed, but encouraged young people to move from this state. And that may or may not do some things to the political spectrum in Wisconsin. I know that for me, most of my college friends do not live in Wisconsin anymore. After graduating, they left to go work in another state. So when they leave, older Americans are staying here, we may see that he's going to be just fine. But I think that his advisors are definitely taking a look at what this means. Thank you, Julia. You can just put it on my front desk. Political parties of the future. Okay, so these are really important. If you want to stay here, if you want to go back, it's totally up to you, okay? The Democratic strategists, so what are political parties doing, especially for this upcoming election? It's Latino voters. Political parties are trying to figure out how to gain the Latino vote. It's the wild card in the world of presidential elections this year. The Latino vote may make or break the election. Because if Latinos follow a party and they feel confident enough to go out and vote, they're going to be a huge population of the voting population. The Democratic strategists are trying to encourage more of a tolerant spirit to attract younger voters. And Republicans have their own unique challenge. They are starting to recognize that the current demographic trends are not working in their favor. So the idea that people who are getting older are tending to go more conservative is helpful, but it's not going to keep them alive for a long period of time because old people die. And so they have to figure out a way to appeal to younger voters so that they don't have to wait for voters to get older to become a part of their party. They want to try and appeal to people who are younger. Another possibility, this is what your book says, if the two parties continue their bitter rivalry on the campaign trail and gridlock persists in Congress, such that the nation's most pressing problems go unaddressed, moderates and those who are weakly attached to a party may become true independents, deciding each election on issues of concern, avoiding identification with a political party altogether. Do I think that that's going to happen in the next year? Absolutely not. But in the next 5 years, could people get so frustrated with these two political parties that they stop affiliating themselves with any of them and simply vote on what they believe on in the issues? Could quite possibly happen. But I don't see that happening anytime soon. So obviously political parties, super important right now. Take a look at what the Democratic Party is doing. Take a look at the candidates that they're providing. This is a very clear sign of what the parties are trying to do. The Democratic Party has 3 candidates running. One is a woman, one is much older and has these very socialist ideas. One is young but not getting a lot of press and was a governor. So they're trying to feel people out, see where they're going to be able to get the most voters. The Republican Party is still this very large group of people that continues to try and find their footing, try and find what they want to be known as. It's an important piece to kind of keep your eyes on. And especially if you feel like you identify with a party, be very critical of what your party is doing right now. Be aware. If you don't agree with what your party is doing, it's important that you sort of take a look at third parties, or even take a look at the party you think you'd hate, simply for the reasons that you want to make sure that the person that you vote for is the person that does the best for you, as opposed to simply the name that's behind their name and things like that. I will tell you, from my perspective, in this next election, I don't know if I will vote my party line. I mean, I don't really have a party. I try not to associate myself with a party, but I'm not super impressed so far with what the candidates in my party have given me as ideas for the future. It's important. Just means that my party may not be appealing to what I need my government to do for me right now. So something to think about. It's definitely something to think about. Okay, so you are finished with lecture for today. You do not have homework. However, if I were you, I would get started on your paper for the debate.
We have to write paper.
Does it have to be like paper or like notes?
Paper. It has to be nicely written. Double spaced, it doesn't matter to me. Oh, I also want to show you this graphic, super interesting. Kind of shows how the parties and independents have been doing. This was what was interesting to me is that independents have actually been growing. But again, that may not be super accurate because people might say they're an independent but not really be an independent.
When's the paper due?